Okay. Linda asked me to wax eloquent about assumptions and beliefs, how they're similar and how they're different. The definitions, as you know from the syllabus, of assumptions are implicit habits of thinking, feeling, behaving, and relating that we're often not consciously aware of. Okay? Beliefs are the conscious stories that we tell ourselves, our conscious, I believe this, right? And we can even do it in the forms of, I believe this because of this, right? But that's what we think of ourselves. So if I were to look at Mr. Seow here and say, okay, what do you believe about trucks, right? He might start waxing eloquent about what trucks are, right? And the difference between our cars and trucks. And he may even go on a wild tear about the superiority of one over the other, right? And so that's a belief. But what assumptions might he have when he sees somebody driving a truck? Okay. And so as a test case, if you were to see my neighbor's truck, it is a Ford truck. It is a 2-ton. It is very large. It's lifted. And across the back of his cab are 2 flagpoles. One says Trump on it, and then the other one is a black and white flag with a blue stripe on it. Okay? So we get to wonder, what do you believe and assume? Like, is this somebody you would want to invite to a dinner party? Right? What assumptions do you already have about my neighbor? And some of you said it's exactly, not only that, he's my bro. I'd love to have him over. He's probably super conservative, just like me. He's super, loves Trump. The election was stolen, right? That there's a lot of things you may assume going in based on just his truck, right? But if I asked you, tell me about your beliefs about the human worth. Are people basically good? Are they basically bad? Then you might start to experience schizophrenia when you start describing your beliefs about human beings and about human nature. And then I point out your assumptions about my friend with the truck, right? He's actually a lovely human being. I like having him over for barbecues. We don't always agree politically. At the same time, though, he's very kind in the way he describes his political position. Very different than what most people would assume when they see a big, loud truck with big old flags on it, right? They assume this is somebody who is going to, run a Democrat off the road and murder them, okay? He's very different than that. So we get to wonder about, what do we assume? When I see a man, when I see a woman, what are my assumptions? Well, first of all, I have a gendered assumption, and my gendered assumption is a gender binary, that there are these people called men and there are these people called women. So therefore, I'm always already fitting people into one of those 2 boxes. Even though there are multiplicities of genders, I'm already fitting them in. When I see people with various skin color, a colleague of mine has pale skin, very dark freckles on his face, bright blue eyes, has very curly, nappy, white blonde hair. And it's really fun hanging out with him because he identifies as African American and he has recessive genes where his body doesn't produce melanin except in his very, very dark freckles. So he's very striking. But it tends to pull for this oddity because people want to either identify him as black or white. And therefore, they give him various weird behaviors when they're first trying to put him in boxes to match their assumptions. Right? Now, when you meet him, everybody believes that he's charismatic, he's engaging, he's very warm, he's very kind. But at the same time, though, their assumptions are getting in the way of relating to him. Okay? So back to the gender example. If you are often identified as a woman, how have you noticed people's behaving towards you? Right? For example, my wife is the mechanic in our family. I am actually under orders, well, not under orders. My wife has asked me very sweetly not to try to fix things, okay? Because when I do, they end up super mega broken. She's very good at fixing things. So it's like some years ago, oh boy, the transmission in our Ford Windstar minivan was in bad shape, and the mechanic told us it'd be $2,500 to rebuild it. My wife felt offended. And she felt offended because when I was with her in the mechanic shop, the mechanic kept speaking to me. My wife's the one that knows about transmissions. I don't know the first thing about them. My wife knows about transmissions. And she would make a claim or ask a question, and the mechanic, who was female, by the way, would look at me and answer the questions as though I had asked them. Okay? What are her assumptions about women? Right? So what assumptions do we have about race? What assumptions do we have about gender? And how do those play out in our behavior? How often are people confronted because of our assumptions? Like, in what way is there misunderstanding or chaos, et cetera, because of our assumptions? And so, again, our assumptions are our habits of thinking, they're our habits of relating, our habits of emoting, and we're not necessarily consciously aware of them until something in our world is different than what we assume. So, by way of example, a colleague of mine in another state, as you guys know, UVU is the fifth institution I've taught for, by far my favorite, by the way. And a colleague of mine in another state was really an advocate and ally in the LGBTQ plus community and had done a lot of really good work until her biological son came out as a trans woman at the age of 16. And she hosted a party for herself and invited her mother and thought her mother would celebrate. So my colleague, the mother, who has done lots of advocacy work for the LGBTQ plus community in rural Indiana, shows up to her son, now daughter's coming out ceremony that her daughter planned for herself. And my colleague lost her shit all over the place. I will never have one of, and I quote, those people living in my house. And she kicked everybody out of the house and had a big screaming match with her now daughter and and basically kicked her out. Her daughter at 16 had to find somewhere else to live. And so the next day, my colleague is coming into our offices and she's venting with me about how she feels betrayed by, and she kept using this word, my son, because my son is not one of those people. It turns out that the reason why she did such awesome humanitarian work and was such a powerful ally of the LGBT community isn't because she actually cared, it's because she pitied them. She saw them as subhumans who had been mistreated by society. It's like one of you going into the animal shelters, right, and doing advocacy for animals. So that it was really that level. And when I confronted her on this, do you realize what you're saying? That all of your advocacy work is done out of pity, not out of equality? She has never spoken to me again, right? And so, like, another friend of mine, he's, very egalitarian racially. He's done work to break down racial barriers and very proudly non-racist until his 15-year-old daughter brought a 16-year-old African-American boy for a dance. And it was really interesting. I didn't expect this from my friend, but watching his discomfort was very, very interesting. And he started telling me, the first time he'd ever told me this, Matt, I'm not racist. Matt, I'm not racist. Don't you understand I'm not racist? And I'm like, Mike, why are you telling me you're not racist? Where is all of this coming from? But it was so disorganizing and upsetting for him, the thought that his daughter was dating a black man. And he couldn't even articulate why. It was so distressing for him. And when he realized that he was distressed, then he was really struggling with, what does it mean about me that I'm distressed? What assumptions do I have about race and about interracial relations, et cetera, that I am freaking out now, right? And so he's come to terms with it. I'm really proud of the work he's done to try to embrace other people authentically. But it was very meaningful to watch somebody that brave in that kind of emotional crisis over an issue of race, okay? In our course, what we're interested in is mental health. So let me share with you a common assumption. I'm not saying that you personally have this assumption. I'm just saying it's a very, very common assumption in the United States. And I see it across politics. I see it across religions. I see it deeply embedded in the field of psychology. And that is the assumption of hedonism, okay? What motivates human behavior and what is good? So at the clinic, when I'm observing my supervisees doing family therapy, I notice families say something over and over and over again. It really blows my mind. And what they will say about their child who is attempting recovery from hardcore addiction, they will say, I just want my child to be happy. Okay? Happiness, pleasure, satisfaction, well-being is a moral good in our society, right? How do you know you're living the good life? Because you're pleasurable, comfortable, you're happy, right? That's a moral good. And so the good life is to accrue stuff, to accrue relationships, to have, which then makes you happy. It's hedonism, right? There's pleasures and satisfactions of life. Now, on the one hand, I'm not saying that these are bad. As you can tell from my full figure, I love the good life. For crying out loud, I am teaching in a heated, vibrating lazy boy. I clearly like comfort. I clearly like pleasures, okay? But what intrigues me is we've turned it into a moral good in our society. Do you know that I have clients who feel guilty about the fact they're depressed? I have clients who feel morally guilty about the fact that they're anxious, that they believe that they should, must, ought be happy. And not only that, though, they've religified it. They've turned it into an issue of religion, that religion can make me happy, and therefore in the name of my faith, I should, must, ought be happy. This blows my mind. Even religion is now hedonistic, right? That it's all about happiness. Follow our religion and you'll be happy. Do our thing and you'll be happy. I don't know about you guys, but life can be really miserable, right? Maybe it's just me, but I've lived a hell of a rough life. I don't recommend my life to anybody. It's been brutal. Some of you who know me personally know the scars I carry. I don't think life is about happiness, or at least not a moralized happiness. I think we get to be happy. I think I get to sit in this lazy boy. I bought on a clearance because it was a return at RC Willey. I could never have afforded this chair except somebody else returned it because it was the wrong color. So I got it for half off and I could afford it and I'm happy about that. But that doesn't mean it's morally good. Okay, we have these strong assumptions that suffering is bad, right? To the point where if somebody's suffering, like if I come to Julia and I'm crying, Julia will feel morally obligated to make my bad feeling go away and to cheer me up. She'll comfort me, she'll hug me, she'll be like, oh, I'm so sorry, Matt, that sucks. And she'll start telling me, comforting things, this too shall pass, whatever else, to make the suffering go away. In fact, it really blows people's minds when I say, I don't want my children to be happy. They may be happy, they may not be happy. I provide them a comfortable life. I love my kids. I want them to be altruistic people. I want them to love and to serve and to care and to try. I want them to be the one that when bullying happens, my kids will be the ones to stand up and go over to the victim and hug them. If not, stand up to the bully and say, stop. I want my kids to be good people. And there will be suffering because of their moral goodness. Okay, that's what I want for my kids. Happiness will take care of itself if you live a meaningful life. Let's not moralize it. Because if you're living a meaningful life, you'll also know suffering. But it's fun when I say that because some people really feel offended. Like, whoa, you're tearing off my blinders, right? Because many people share the assumption. Why is depression bad? Now, I'm not saying why is depression miserable. Like many of us, if statistics bear out, many of us have suffered depression pretty horribly before. I get that it's not pleasant. I get that it's something when I experience it, I'd like help not to experience it for so long. At the same time, though, it's not bad. It's not morally bad. It's uncomfortable. It's miserable. It de-energizes me. It distracts me from relationships. It makes me want to crawl into my bed and not get out for a week, right? That's what it does. But it's not morally bad. I don't need to be judged as a depressed person just because I suffer, right? And so I'm trying to kind of highlight how our assumptions play out in the field of abnormal psychology. And so our cultural assumptions, not only our individual assumptions like Brandon and Zach and Chris, it's not just our assumptions personally, it's also America's assumptions, it's Utah's assumptions, it's UVU's assumptions, it's this clinic's assumptions, right? Our shared assumptions also play out in a big way. There is a strong tendency to assume that we are in charge of our own destiny. In fact, America is built on this assumption. I love how often I hear that if you work hard, you'll be successful. Now, that may indeed be the case. And all the successful people I know have worked very hard. Here's the thing, though, that nobody talks about. The vast majority of people I know who are working 80 hours a week and who will die having lived an entire life working 80 hours a week just to make ends meet aren't financially successful, right? Hard work doesn't guarantee anything. You need hard work to get ahead, but hard work alone doesn't do it, okay? And so therefore, if I encounter somebody who is living out of a shopping cart on Center Street in Provo, my assumption is he's not working hard enough. If he just got a job, if he just worked hard, he wouldn't be homeless anymore, right? And likewise, we even see this come out in discourse, like when the city council meetings who receive proposals to build this homeless shelter, to do this advocacy work, you get to hear the city council people, as well as the citizens, our dear citizens of Springville, Provo, Orem, start to talk about their assumptions, and they don't even realize they're talking about their assumptions. They talk about their beliefs, and you can see the assumptions underneath if you know what to pay attention to. Like when I moved here 12 years ago, there's a building actually out on Geneva Road, and many of you have driven by it not knowing what it is, but it has 25 beds and a commercial grade kitchen in it, and it's still sitting empty, and it's been sitting empty for 13 years because the people who own it keep trying to turn it into a place to house homeless families in crisis. But the good citizens of Orem keep shutting it down because they don't want those people in their backyard, right? Now, keep in mind, when I go to city council meeting, I get to hear the objections from the good citizens of Orem, and I get to talk to these people afterwards. And you'll have to trust me, I do so very non-aggressively, I'm very diplomatic, but I ask them, what do you mean by those people? And all of their beliefs and assumptions about what homeless people are. Well, we don't want crack addicts and prostitutes and all. Wait, so you're saying families in crisis are drug addicts and prostitutes and things like that? You guys get where I'm coming from? And that's the assumption. And the assumption is guiding their behavior. So when I actually bring a family in crisis, like a woman who has been financially trapped by her husband for 10 years because he controls all of the finances. Her names aren't on any of the cars. It's not on the house. It's not on any of the bank accounts. He controls her. He beats her when he wants. He rapes her when he wants, right? He's pillar of the community, bright, shiny guy. He's active in his church, owns a prestigious building, right? She's trapped. She escapes. Is there anywhere for her to go in our society? No, because he's helped her alienate friends if he's not already alienated all friends and family for her. She's got nowhere to go. But the assumption is the people who need this crisis shelter are crack addicts and prostitutes, okay? So it's our job, or mine and Linda's job, to help you all begin to dig into your guts. What really are my assumptions? And we don't grade you based on what your assumptions are, right? You may think that my friend across the street with the big Trump flags on his truck is an asshole, right? You may assume and believe that no matter how nice he is. Great, I don't care. I'm not going to grade you on that. I want you to dig into your guts and say, yeah, when a Trump truck roars by, this is what it evokes from me. You know what I mean? And that's great. Own it, right? Likewise, when you're walking down Center Street and a young man, even though it's like 40 degrees, he's not wearing a shirt, he's got thick calluses on his bare feet, tattered jeans, comes up and starts chatting with you, right? And it's clearly his communication isn't clear. What are your assumptions? That he's high, that he's mentally ill, and whose fault is it? Is it society's fault? Is it his fault? Like, what is your reaction? Is your first reaction fear? Is your first reaction to hug? Is your first reaction to give money? Like, what is your first reaction? Because that's usually where your assumptions are, okay? Then your second reaction is when you start talking to yourself, wait a minute, he's just a guy, he's clearly either high or he's mentally ill, calm down, see what he needs, right? Then that reaction is your beliefs. What's fun is that our behavior is far more often guided by our assumptions than our beliefs, okay? In fact, it's to the point where many psychologists of morality have begun to argue that morality is epiphenomenal. It doesn't actually exist. Because when we ask people, like if I were to sit down with Jackson and Esmeralda and have them list out their moral, religious values, whatever, and then if I were to watch them like a hawk, you know what I mean? Just measure their every behavior. Would every behavior conform to their moral values? Jackson's like, of course it would. Okay, and maybe he's rare. Maybe he's going to be translated, he's a saint. But Esmeralda and I are black sheep. We can make these moral protestations, right? Here's our moral position. And we're not very good at living up to our moral ideals. So therefore, does morality even exist is a question that some of my colleagues in psychology ask. Now, if you're curious about my answer is of course it does. Morality is aspirational. It doesn't mean it's actual, right? that I can aspire to be a better moral person in these ways. Just because I fail to do that sometimes doesn't mean that my aspirations are false. And unlike what my colleagues in psychology argue. So Linda asked me to rap about, and I actually didn't set it to a beat, did I? But to rap about assumptions and beliefs for a minute. As you guys are reading, what do you assume and believe about the homeless? What do you assume and believe about mental illness? What do you assume and believe about pleasure and suffering? That I'm trying to challenge you to start thinking, wait a minute. Next time I'm anxious, can I just embrace the fact that I'm anxious and that it's unpleasant rather than me telling myself that I shouldn't feel anxious? Next time I'm depressed, maybe I can just say, wow, this sucks. I don't enjoy being depressed, but that's what's going on. So I won't feel ashamed to ask for help. Okay. And so why have we moralized it? Why have we turned this into something that is shameful? And so that's what you guys get to dig into your guts about. Okay, so Linda, is that rap sufficient, do you believe?
I would say so.
Okay. So hopefully that's helpful as you guys are working on your essays for this class, is just to go back, okay, what do I assume? What are my first impressions? What is my initial reaction? Because that often gives you an indication of what your assumptions are. Okay, questions before we go on to the diabolical suit, because Chris reminded me he wanted to talk about that. Okay, if you're bashful, please use the comments feature, and then I'll pause every now and again and look and go over the comments, and we can talk about those. Because I understand some of you are mannerly and polite and don't just blurt out, interrupt people like I do. So that's a skill I'm working on.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
What's going to happen with our quiz this week?
Well, that's a great question.
Do you want me to talk about that, Matt?
You can, or would you prefer I do?
I can do it if you want.
Sure.
So basically what's going to happen with this week's quiz is we kind of did a big oopsie. And by we, I mean Matt. Sorry, Matt, but
it's true.
So basically, what happened was questions on the Chapter 2 quiz ended up being based in Chapter 3, and the Chapter 3 quiz is also based in Chapter 3. But basically, you're all going to get full points on this quiz. Personally, I still encourage you to read Chapter 2 and even still take the quiz. That way you can get used to like how Matt words questions, and that way it can maybe possibly help you kind of look for things in your reading going into like the next few chapters. That way these quizzes don't really become kind of foreign or scary to you anymore. Does that make sense?
Yes. On the week, on the calendar say, we ask for people that right.
So
Okay.
I didn't get that. She cut out really bad. Did anyone else get that?
Esmeralda, would it be helpful if you typed out the message? Because apparently we're getting feedback on your end.
Yeah. Awesome.
Thank you. Okay. So one of the things that is important as I'm trying to figure out the suffering that a client is endeavoring, like what does it mean? What are the origins of their suffering, whether it's depression, anxiety, PTSD, addictions, bipolar, is the ways in which we are involved in the lives of other people, and what other people do matter to us, and it affects us. Like many of us in the Western tradition are taught things like sticks and stones may break your bones, but names will never hurt you. And that's a lovely little rhyme that is a lie. sticks and stones can break our bones if applied with sufficient force. And names destroy the soul. Like, emotional abuse is more psychologically damaging than physical abuse is, and physical abuse is psychologically damaging. So it's very interesting to see that people who are victims of emotional bullying have worse outcomes than those who are just victims of physical bullying alone. The other thing is we get to wonder, like, when the abuser chooses to abuse, they are aware of how they felt when they were abused, and yet there they are perpetuating that with a new victim or sets of victims. And it can get very confusing and painful when you sit down by somebody who is abusing other people like they were abused, and you just hold up a light to it, right? Hold up a mirror and shine a light on it. It often evokes a lot of very upset, very confused, very hurt feelings, trauma feelings from those that were traumatized who are now perpetuating the trauma. And so, for those of you who are interested, there's a lot of therapy needed in prisons, because many of the men in prisons chose to abuse, right? That they're perpetuating the suffering. There's Wabash Valley, it's one of the prisons I worked in. At Wabash Valley, the guards would actively break one of the rules, which is when they would introduce a certain man into general population, there was one crime that they would announce, and only one. They wouldn't announce fraud or possession or intention to distribute or rape or murder or robbery or burglary or anything like that. They would always announce if somebody was guilty of a sex crime against a minor, and they would call them chomos, which was short for child molester, chomos. And so they would bring the man out into the yard and say, "Another chomo," right? Which was against all sorts of prison policy, but they would make an exception, and everybody made the exception for chomos. The prisoners would make exceptions, the guards would make it, the administration would make exceptions, and it didn't matter how many times I filed appeals saying we need to stop doing this. Everybody would say, well, they're chomos, right? They deserve no protection. They are now immune to the law. So a little bit of background. The term outlaw means outside the law. So let's say I am a magistrate and you commit a crime and you're brought before me in chains. Rather than throwing you in jail or hanging you on the spot, one of the options is I could declare you outlaw, which means that you are now immune to the law. I mean, anything can happen to you and no one will suffer the consequences. It's like you are now the target of everybody else's hate. So people can spit on you, rape you, kill you, etc., and they will suffer no consequences. They can steal from you, and they will suffer no consequences. That's why being declared outlaw was so horrible, and why in the Western tradition, outlaws were made out to be desperate men. You know, the roguish rapscallion who's living only on his wits. It's because anybody could do anything they wanted to him or her without consequence. They're outside the law. And that's the way chomos are treated in some prisons, that if you're an abuser of children, then you are now immune. The prison won't protect you. The usual rules about protective custody and things like that now don't apply unless a staff member intervenes on your behalf. So in getting to know these men who were declared chomos and the violence they would suffer, I learned a couple of things. One is many of the men who were quick to rape or beat or attempt to murder the men who were called chomos were themselves abused as children. Okay, so therefore it was this rage at the abuser, which on the one hand is understandable, on the other hand is deeply unfortunate. And likewise, in getting to know those who had committed sex offenses against children, it's this deep-seated traumatic confusion about what relationships are, especially when it comes to relationships to children. They never got to learn a healthy way. And so, although they feel ashamed and traumatized by the abuses they suffer, they also felt love for their abuser. And so therefore, they then perpetuate that in some cases with the children they abuse. So the diabolical suit is, So if you're a religious person, I'm not attacking you. Please don't go to the dean and say, Dr. Draper told a story in class, he personally attacked me. I don't know you. I can't attack you. Don't tell a dean the lie. Okay? When I was a teenager, I met a successful businessman whose entire shtick was fraud, graft, and corruption. He was shining example of moral and religious purity, right? But frankly, his career was fraud, okay? And he wore very tasteful suits. His face was always clean shaven. His haircut was always short and tight. He had the appearance of a successful businessman. But I was unfortunately able, or fortunately able, to see that the suit was diabolical. It was a way to manipulate. It was a way to control. It was a way to profit from other people in a way that was fraudulent. And as this man would sit in church at the front of the church, he was a church leader, and I knew what he did for a living. I began to see the ways in which we dress to control other people's impressions of us. And so, as you guys know, I'm hairy. Boy, if you see me in a tie, either I've got a hot date or the apocalypse is nigh. And so I can remember I was exploring religions in my mid-late 20s, and I went to an LDS church. You know, I've got, long beard, and I show up in a sweater and jeans and comfy loafers. And the bishop of that particular ward, who later became a dear friend of mine, assumed that I knew better. And so he came up to me and started teaching me that the uniform of the priesthood in that religion is white shirt and tie, clean shaven, and short hair. And I told him, I say, that's the devil's uniform. And he goes, what do I mean? I said, look, when you work in prisons, the people who engage in fraud, graft, corruption wear the same suits that you do. They have the same haircut. They're also clean shaven. It's impression management is what you're doing. And so when you tell me that I need to be clean shaven, white shirt and tie, short hair, what you're telling is you want me to make impressions like the devil does. I don't want to manipulate people in that way. I will not wear the diabolical suit. I will wear a suit, and my suit will be bomb ass, and it will be sexy AF, but it won't be your suit, okay? What you're doing is you're engaging in impression management and thinking God is telling you to do it. Okay, no, God's not telling you what clothing to wear. In fact, read scripture about people who put on fancy attire and their crisping pins and their bangles, etc. And it's not friendly what scripture says about people who are dressing up, dressing fancy. I said, please, let's not wear a diabolical suit. Please, let's dress modestly, which doesn't mean covered up, by the way. The word modest doesn't mean that. It means humbly. It means rather than wearing your $500 suit to church, how about you take $450 of that, feed a family some sandwiches for a few weeks, and maybe put on just a shirt and pants? You know what I mean? So, yeah, that's the diabolical suit. And so I just saw the way this very powerful man, in fact, when he went to prison, everybody seemed surprised but me. Oh my gosh, but he's pillar of the community, and he's so religious and so... And in fact, one of the things that I loved is he was one of the most surprised of all. Like, he genuinely thought that because he looked like a good guy, nothing he did was a problem. It was. He destroyed people financially. He profited from the wreckage of their lives and did so illegally. So all the suffering that he created, how many suicide attempts came out of the thousands of people he defrauded and bankrupted? How many children were raised with desperate pain and turned to addiction? Like, how much damage did he do just because he looked and acted the part in his diabolical suit? So that's what that means, Chris, if thank you for reminding me. So when I'm working with families and I'm working with those suffering from addiction, very often they're not even aware of the way in which their suffering is embedded in a nexus of other people that have contributed to, and in some cases lessened, the suffering that's happening in the system. And so one of the things that worries me as a psychologist teaching a psychology class, that I inadvertently perpetuate the message to you all that your clients are singular individuals with self-contained lives within the boundaries of their own flesh. When I'd also like to teach the other, which is, on the one hand, that's true. We are singular people in many ways. At the same time, though, we are also embedded in a nexus of relationships that matter, that affect us and that we affect. And if we want to understand people well, we need to look at human relationships. We are constituted within those to a large degree. So one of the models that you'll read about in your textbook is the diathesis stress model. So according to these theorists, diathesis is a vulnerability to a particular mental illness. Stress is which taxes or overwhelms our resources, right? That which traumatizes, causes us to break down. When you have a predisposition to this stress, it can bloom a disorder, it can bloom a mental health diagnosis: depression, anxiety, PTSD, bipolar, schizophrenia, et cetera, ad nauseum. Now, on the one hand, I appreciate that people are looking into this because I'm very curious why. Okay, so I know a family and there are 5 children in the family. I know a lot of families, this family in particular, and there are 5 children. Each child is by a different man. Two of the children are by the same man, 3 are by different men. And mom was a meth addict and would sell her sexual services in exchange for methamphetamine and would get pregnant. And 4 of the 5 children were born addicted to meth. I'm very close to the oldest daughter of this family. She's a dear friend of mine. And her brother and her are the only 2 from the same biological father. The 3 are from 3 other different dads. And what's really interesting is you look at how all of them turned out. The oldest 2, who had actually experienced the most chaos because DCFS came in later and removed all 5 children from the house many, many years ago. But the oldest 2 have turned out remarkably well. This dear friend of mine is a public speaker, TED talker, beautiful human being, loving mom, turned out great. She's currently in grad school. Then the son is a specialist in the US Navy. He does underwater welding, and it's a very difficult, very rare profession. And although he lives alone, he's pillar of the community, good guy, hasn't figured out how to date, et cetera, because his modeling was so toxic. But the other 3, in and out of jail, in and out of prison, polysubstance abuse, polysubstance addiction, et cetera. And so why is it that the oldest 2 turned out really well? Like, I can't think of the oldest going to jail, and the second oldest, that's unthinkable as well. But the other 3, yeah, those kids are, well, they're all adults, but they live very colorful, very difficult lives. So what's going on that these 2 are okay, and these 3 are suffering so much more? Not to say the oldest 2 don't suffer, but all of them suffer, and 3 in ways that involve bringing on other people to suffering, right? Drug addiction and violent crime, et cetera. And so what is it? What are the protective factors? One of the things that we do in psychology is we look at inside people, genetically, personality, et cetera, for the protective factors of their bodies. And we think that that's what spares them from future suffering. But this presents circular logic. So in order for me to have a diagnosis, a mental health condition, then I had to have the diathesis for it. And the only way I can tell if I had a diathesis for a given mental illness is because I have the mental illness. This is circular logic. How does this shit get published, right? So you guys get that it's circular logic. So I have a mental illness, so therefore I must have had a diathesis to the mental illness. How do we know I had a diathesis to the mental illness? Well, it's because I have the mental illness. Right? One of the things I wonder about is maybe human relationships are protective factors. I know the oldest girl in this family well, and I look at the teachers that she had. I look at the people who were doing Sub for Santa, the people that were involved in the management of the various apartment complexes that they lived in growing up, the way in which she was suffered the worst devastations of her mother's lifestyle, her mother's demons, by other people. I look at her just younger brother and I see very similar things unfold, right? That I'm wondering if we can be protective factors for one another. So like, it's lovely for me, like on Marco Polo or chat threads on Instagram, where I see people suffering and other people embracing them in the face of their suffering. There are those billboards some of you have seen and some of the ads online where it just shows one person just reaching over and kind of side hugging somebody else who's crying, and they say, this is suicide prevention, right? And it seems like we can be a part of the resilience of other people, and it's something that psychology doesn't talk about much. So protective factors are all of those things that can turn stressors into growth experiences. Okay, like this little flower here, I love it. It's covered, partly covered in black asphalt, right? And yet there it is, still growing. So what are those protective factors? And so a psychologist will talk about attitudes and personality and even genetics because of the philosophical materialism that is currently a fad in our field. And they talk about resilience. Resilience is good outcomes despite high risk status, meaning why is it that some kids who come from trauma and poverty go on to become healthy and capable? So resilience is also identified as sustained competence under threat, that when we're really feeling crushed down by life, that we still manage to put one foot in front of the other, even if it's not very fast, and even if we're stumbling, we keep moving ahead. So when I was a freshman in college, I got to meet Kwaku, and Kwaku was from an East African country that suffered a civil war. And one of the things that is remarkable about Kwaku is he has a scar that goes from the top of his head down along his jawline to about here. So from about here to here. And many people assume that it's pretty jagged. It's a gnarly scar. And many people assume that he had some kind of like brain tumor or something where they had to cut open his skull. In actuality, that was the cut from a machete when he was a little kid. A group of soldiers, for lack of a better word, but men in trucks showed up and just started slaughtering everybody in his village. And when he got hit by the machete, it cracked his skull, cut the side of his head and face open, and he was left unconscious but survived. His entire family, well, his mother and two siblings, when he woke up, had been just chopped, just hacked to pieces. And so his whole story of him nearly starving to death and getting access to help and support and food, and eventually his immigration to the United States, etc. It's a very inspiring story. What's remarkable is Kwaku is one of the kindest, warmest people you'll ever be around. And I don't get to see him very often. He lives in Maine now, but even when I hear missives from him, just these little text messages out of the blue, it's just the warmth and the kindness just comes through. And so Kwaku still sleeps on the floor on a hard pallet. He sleeps behind very heavy locked doors. The trauma is still there. At the same time, though, his performance in the face of that trauma, how much he has recovered, is remarkable. So that's one of the things we mean by resilience. So I would like to sensitize you to some assumptions in the field of psychology, and there are many. One is about what causes human behavior and human suffering. So the debate rages in our field between nature and nurture. So nature is what biologically about you helps cause your mental illness. You know, what's biological about me helps cause my mental illness. So nurture is the historical cause. It's like what happened to you over time that caused you to feel depressed in adulthood or anxious or bipolar or PTSD, right? And the debate raged for a long time about nature and nurture, which one it is. There was a study that was just released, it was early December, that some of my colleagues are now arguing that personality is all just genetic, and they're resurrecting that old debate. And then the nurture people will come in and say it's not just nature, here's all the nurture stuff, and then it'll eventually be, okay, it's nature and nurture is what causes your behavior. they're leaving out two things. Context. There are some contexts which erode human well-being. Like, it doesn't matter who you are, it's going to erode your well-being. And many of these contexts and the people within them they're very talented at blaming you for your dissolution, like the poison, the symptoms of poison that you suffer within that context. And I've seen this a lot in family systems where parents are very good at making siblings to blame for other siblings' behavior. And if the siblings who are being blamed dare rebel, then the parents heap down with more guilt and shame. How dare you? You know, we're a family. How dare you? Well, that's toxic. Children can't be responsible for children. That's the parents' job. And if the parents are incapable or incompetent, siblings relate to siblings. We don't get to control one another's behavior. I can't parent my siblings. Boy, could you imagine all the fireworks that could happen if I could? Oh my gosh, right? Instead, all I can do is love and support them as a sibling while they make their very destructive life choices. That's what they did for me, and I'm very grateful. I learned very painfully from my experiences to live, love, and relate differently than I did. So other contexts are toxic, like super maximum security prisons, like living in solitary confinement. That context is toxic in and of itself. You don't need nature and nurture to psychologically fall apart in solitary confinement. Solitary confinement will do that, okay? So a lot of our well-being is situated within the context of our relationships. And if we change our relationships, our well-being changes. It's like one of the best outcomes we see for addiction is when somebody comes out of our treatment center and they move to a different state where they don't know anybody, where they're not hanging around with the context of the same friends and the same family, that they change their context radically. There's no calls, there's no Facebook, there's no Instagram, there's no Snapchats, there's no TikTok videos back and forth. It is radical, new number, new state, new city. And that's what it takes for many of these men and women to get and stay sober. Because if they go back to their context, that's where the poison is. And what's painfully ironic is many times they're going back to a context with friends and family who want them to be sober. But the situation itself is poisonous, even if it's against the belief of the people involved. Like, for me, as you know, I'm the black sheep of my family. And therefore, I have siblings that no matter what I do, no matter how many teaching awards and research awards and writing awards and accolades I get, I'm still the black sheep. They don't want their children around unless they're there to supervise me, right? And so therefore, that's a part of my feeling in relation with them. And it's not necessarily pleasant all the time, although sometimes it is. Okay, so we don't have any comments here. So the fourth thing I want to just remind you all of is human agency. So we have nature and nurture, context, which is a large part of our suffering, and choices as well. That sometimes we suffer the choices of other people, and sometimes we suffer the consequences of our own choices. Now, a lot of the suffering of my youth was because I was making unwise choices, and suffering the consequences of those choices taught me wisdom, right? In fact, I have a t-shirt. This one says, "Ego can only betray," and we don't have time to talk about all the things this could mean today. But I have another one that says, good judgment basically unfolds out of the consequences of bad judgment, right? Bad judgment gives us experience, and experience gives us good judgment. So that's part of it, is we learn. And so part of what can happen with certain forms of suffering is some people, like me, need help to figure out what the lesson is, to modify the behavior. How do I make myself depressed? When I'm depressed, how do I make it worse? When I'm anxious, how do I perpetuate the anxiety? When I am already anxious, what do I do to perpetuate that anxiety, right? So it turns out we have some say into it. I don't think we're magical or superpowered. We don't have all say over ourselves, We all have bodies, and our bodies seem to do their own thing sometimes. But at the same time, we do have some say. So thank you guys very much for hanging out with me today. I'm Matt Draper. This has been my TED Talk. And any questions in closing before we prep for Monday? Nope. Okay. Well, I will see you all on Monday then. Bye-bye now.